Well, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's program, our Rural Resiliency, Caring for You and Others, as we start this 4-part webinar series tonight. This webinar is hosted by the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy team. So Fred Hall is on the call tonight. Myself, Jen Bentley, and Larry Tranel are all on the call tonight. And we have the pleasure of working with our colleague, Dr. Larry Tranel, as our featured speaker. So tonight, before we get started, before Larry's presentation, I would like to put up 2 poll questions just to help us better understand how our audience has experienced stress, either experienced it with themselves or with others. So I'm going to start the poll here, and you guys can go ahead and put in your answers. The question that I have up there is, have you seen indications of personal stress in the farmers in your area or experienced it yourself? So there's about 36 participants on the call here this evening. So we'll let those come in here. I'll give you about 10 more seconds here to log in. So we just have 2 questions here. It just gives us a better understanding of the information that we're presenting here this evening. And so Larry, it looks like the majority of them have voted here. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And you should be able to see those results on your screen. And the majority have seen or experienced some stress in their area. So second question, has there been an instance that has prompted you to some action or intervention? So have you seen signs of stress and taken action for either yourself or someone that you know? And I know, Larry, you're going to address, some of this action and intervention ways that we can help others deal with the stress, and that's going to be a lot of the series is dealing with that stress. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll here and share those. And it looks like about 60% of our participants here this evening have said there has been an instance where they've had to take some action or intervention. So Larry, I hope that gives you a good indication of our audience here tonight. I am going to stop sharing my screen and then introduce you and welcome you to the webinar here tonight. So you can go ahead and launch your video here.
Okay, appreciate it.
So while Larry's presentation pulled up, I'll go ahead and introduce him. Dr. Larry Tranel has spent 10 years as a dairy farm management agent with the University of Wisconsin Extension, in the past 21 years as a dairy field specialist with Iowa State University Extension. Dr. Tranel specializes in milking systems and housing facilities, dairy and financial management, grazing and organic dairying, and farm mental health. He is the author of the Dairy Trans Financial Management Program, the Dairy Trans Low Cost Parlor, the Millionaire Model Dairy Farm Project, and a host of other very successful programs that have earned him many distinguished awards. Larry is a graduate of UW-Platteville, where he's earned his bachelor and master's degrees and holds distinguished alumni honors. He also is an ordained minister and holds a doctorate in pastoral psychology, which has really sparked his interest and expertise in farm stress and behavioral health. So with that, Larry, I think you bring a great expertise in knowing agriculture and having that farm stress background as well. So I'll let you go ahead.
So first of all, welcome to our Rural Resilience, Caring for You and Yours. This webinar series is a 4-part series that kind of build on each other. Tonight, we're going to talk about farm stress, resiliency, and grief. And then next week, we're going to talk about personality keys when married to farm stress. And I find that in my work that these personalities and the understanding of personalities is pretty pertinent to farm stress itself. Then we're going to talk about the stress of men and women, and also with what do you tell the kids. And our last session is going to kind of be more in depth about brain and behavioral health hacks that we can try to use in our own lives to try to mitigate stress. So thanks to our cooperators, there's 11 university extension services that are a part of this webinar series, along with these dioceses that are listed here as well, the Archdiocese of Dubuque, the synods of Northeastern, Southeastern, and Western Iowa, along with the Wisconsin Council of Churches, other rural church organizations, in addition to other agribusinesses that are hosting sites as well, and other organizations. And it's all based on material with this USDA NIFA award number, a mental health grant that we have with the Iowa State Extension Dairy team. So when we take a look at stress, what is the face of stress? Okay, it's different for everybody. But if I take a look at most farmers, and as we take a look at stress, it's actually a pileup of stressors that tends to cause the problem, not individual stresses themselves. So when we take a look at these pileup of farm stressors, let's think about it. So, up late last night, didn't get much sleep, a cow was sick, we lose an asset like a cow, water line breaks, we have families, marriage concerns, machinery breaks down, and the cost of those nowadays, a farm accident, laid up so I can't milk, the hay got ruined, the soil got eroded with the rain last night, labor didn't show up, milk equipment breakdown that happened on Christmas Eve, milk price volatility, the cows had to be sold. You think about costs and you think about cash flow, corn needing to be replanted, 16 to 18-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week, the heat, the snow, the ice that we deal with, anxiety, loss, and grief. Sometimes we have drought, we often have hopelessness, floods. And when we take a look at even things of depression, so we wonder sometimes, what's next? Why me? Not again. Nobody gets what's going on here. Is it truly worth it for us to continue? So I take a look at the years that I was farming and working off the farm as well, and all these stressors that I just listed. And sometimes I might have 2 or 3 of these stressors that would happen to me before 5 o'clock in the morning. And so when we take a look at each of our lives, what are the stressors that we're dealing with? And whether you're a farmer or one of those that help farmers, what are the stressors that we deal with so we can understand to better help ourselves, to better help some of our farm clients? So again, what is your face of stress? How do you deal with it? So when we take a look at the way that we face stress, I seriously think can help us better face stress. A happier face comes from a happier mindset. And research shows that we can actually reinterpret the negative to improve our personal well-being in our lives, and that's what we're after. So we talk about positive psychology. How do you think? How do you do? How do you be positive in most situations in our lives? And I realize it's not always available for us to do that. So a couple of things I want us to start thinking about. Where are we on the emotional scale? How positive, how negative? So when we take a look at enthusiasm, a very positive emotion versus neuroticism, we take a look at those negative emotions. Where are we on that scale? And then we think, even more importantly, where are you on the positive thinking scale? Because the positive thinking scale is more of a driver than the positive emotion scale. So the increase our state of being, we can do that with positive psychology. So when we take a look at COVID, social distancing, farmer style, we're also already isolated, and now we've been asked to even isolate even more. But how do we take a look at trying to help our own mental health? And I tend to think we can talk about farm stress versus happiness. And when I talk about happiness, I'm not talking about short-term happiness. I'm trying to look at true meaning and true joy in our lives. We also take a look at our positive thinking that we just talked about, and how do we get over those negative emotions that tend to help us, protect ourselves and things like that. But the sad thing is sometimes we just can't get over them to get to the next step, to think more positively. So we look at farm stress tools. Do we come from inside of ourselves or from outside of ourselves? And I want us to try to focus on what's inside. So from the inside out, we think about the things that we look at, the vision that we have, our breathing techniques, our activity, our posture, the exercise, the expressions that we carry around on our face, and how we do meditation, prayer, relaxation, calming type things, versus things that come from the outside in to try to deal with our stress. We might have a glass of wine, cup of coffee, cup of tea. We might get some outside therapy, some counseling. We might be sitting in a hot tub, medication, taking some pills to try to help with anxiety, depression, and things like that. But I think the focus, at least from my perspective, is how do we help ourselves focus on things that help meditate versus medicate, things that come from the inside versus the outside to help us deal with the stressors in our lives. We also realize that happiness is often fleeting. Okay, it's kind of fleeting. It's there for a moment and then it's gone. But it's often a matter of perception as well. So we realize that commodity prices and the weather, they kind of mirror the ups and the downs of life. And it's important for us to think of that farm happiness index. That sometimes it is weather, or sometimes it is the prices going up or down that really make the day. And so that really impacts our own attitude in how we work, how we play, how we relate to our family. And the difference in how that affects us can affect the kids or affect our spouse, affect other people in the community. So it's important for us to realize that our positive emotion or negative emotions are very easily transferred in this situation called transference. I'm sure we've all been in situations where we're in a room and everybody's just having a jolly old time. And then somebody comes into that room that isn't in such a good mood, and how quickly that mood can actually spiral downward. So again, the importance of transferring positive, not negative emotions to other people. So I get asked this every now and then, can you control your happiness? And the answer is, well, it depends, and in part. So we realize that genetic wise, about 50% of your happiness is actually genetic. It's just kind of in your being. You have a disposition to be happy or not, depending on what happens with you in life. But the important part is that 40% of it you can control. And there's only about 10% of it that's left over. And what's that due to? That's due to circumstances. So I think it's important for us to realize that our circumstances, those things that happen to us in our lives, are only about 10% of our happiness. We have control of about 40% of it. So I think there's a significant control of happiness and meaning in our lives. So happiness and longevity. I like to share this slide because I think it's kind of interesting. So there was a nun study, which basically was a school of sisters, I think of Notre Dame. And basically when they came into the convent, they were asked to write some kind of a biography. And in there, they actually kept those biographies until later in life when they got to be 80 and 90 years old, until a lot of them actually passed away. And it's interesting to note that the top 25% of those biographies for positive emotional words live 9.4 years longer. Okay, there is connection between happiness and longevity in our productivity. We also realize there's a lot of negative things that happen in our lives, and those negative changes, they tend to have enduring declines in satisfaction, sometimes over long periods of time. But I also find it interesting to note that feeling lousy tends to carry off into the next day. So what can we do in our lives to not carry over lousy feelings the next day? Make it a habit to do something different. But also interesting was that the positive feelings did not carry over into the next day. So what kind of habits can we have when we start waking up in the morning to make sure we're starting our days off in a positive way? People who enjoy life had a 28% lower risk of death. People who are happier, they're more flexible, more resilient. So yes, there is a lot of things about being happy in life that really equate to our mental health and our physical health as well. So we're going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about farm markets, because we have farm market reality, we have farm market stress, and we have farm market grief. And we've experienced that, especially in the dairy industry, but other ag enterprises as well over the last couple of years. So as we talk about that, it's important for us to keep our sense of reality about us. Okay, and it also doesn't hurt to keep a sense of humor about us as well as we talk about it. So market reality, how do we understand those past market cycles and the current market forces and any future market opportunities? Okay, we can try to stay on top of it, but it's impossible to have a clear understanding of it because it's based on a complex set of economical, political, cultural, other situations just with the signature of somebody's pen that can affect farm incomes over time. When we take a look at the reality is that the future is uncertain. And if we knew what that future would be, I doubt if anyone would be sitting in the seats that we are today, because we'd be so darn rich if we would know what the future of those markets truly were. So we talk about market stress. I define it as an extended period of time where we have these low product prices or we have these high input costs that cause negative margins or negative cash flow. We've all experienced it with these asset values, commodity prices at times that shrink down, sometimes quite far down. And we also have these input costs that sometimes skyrocket, gyrate. We all have to think back maybe in 2008 when corn prices really increased, they skyrocketed. The input costs, what did they do? They tended to follow. When that corn price came back down, what happened? The input costs forgot to come back down. 2008 greatly changed the structure, the economic structure of agriculture. And then we talk about market grief, when things get even worse. We've seen recessions, there's actually a psychology of market grief, but it's our reaction to the loss of something. Maybe we lost some profit, maybe we lost a lot of assets, maybe we lost a way of life, something that is loved, something that's cherished, and that's why we grieve it. because our finances, the cash flow might not work out. And this is happening for extended periods of time, market grief. Okay, so it can be overwhelming. So sometimes we just put our heads down and say, well, holy cow, what do I do now with all this market grief? So when we become overwhelmed, it can cause us a lot of exhaustion, a lot of immobilization where we just seem like we can't move, we lack energy, we can't get out of bed, a loss of hope. And that's just a word that when you start taking people that lose hope, just when you take a look at what happens in their life, the loss of spirit, things like that. So sometimes being overwhelmed can trigger anxiety in our minds, the anger, the tears that might come. And bottom line, it can cause us to have a loss of good decision-making ability, which is extremely important at a time when we're already stressed out. We need to have that. So at some point in time, we might not be able to make those decisions. When do we seek help? So with the market stress and grief, we often wonder, what can I do to just get out of this mess? Or can I save some of the lifestyle? Can I save some of the assets as we're taking a look at this? So recognize that need to seek help at times, especially when we're highly stressed, to make better, more informed, objective decisions. And we don't make these decisions out of confusion. We don't want to make them out of emotion because they tend not to be very good. And we have to do this at a time when confusion and emotions tend to be running extremely high. So a part of that reality is that farm markets might get tougher, farming might get tougher. Exports, we've got a big dependence on exports. They might not clear the additional milk, the added grains. Sometimes we have processing constraints. And we also realize that a reality is that markets are not always humane. Markets are here to provide a price point, to balance that supply and demand. And even if it's extremely low, you think of the hog industry in the late 1990s and how low those hog prices actually got. So those benefits of a free market, they do not come without a cost. The reality is there's a probability of farm enterprises that will continue to increase in size. Those economies of scale, which are definitely not as big as some people think they are, but there's still opportunities that exist for small, medium-sized farms. There might be tougher profit margins, there might be higher asset loads, and even costs of doing business, but I still do think opportunities exist. So I tend to say, and my colleagues, Fred and Jen would as well, that every farm needs an operating plan. And every farm needs an exit strategy as well, which is setting a point where we're no longer willing to accept equity loss. And we're going to exit this industry or reallocate our resources to another enterprise. Because the easiest route is to simply do nothing, hoping things that resolve themselves. Okay, but we need to be proactive, not reactive or passive in this situation, because unfortunately, it hardly ever works to be just reactive or passive. I've had farmers tell me quite a bit over the last 31 years of my career is that I'm just going to farm till it's all gone. Now that is an operating plan, and that also is an exit strategy. It might not be the best one, but that's what they had in their mindset. So we realize the reality of that there's more to life than the farm. And sometimes that's difficult when this farm has come from so many generations, 3, 4, 5 generations. I might be the last generation to milk cows in this barn. So even when our life has been the farm, again, a generational type thing, we raised our family there. So one's emotion and our identity, sometimes we become so closely tied to the land, so closely tied to the livestock and the legacy of it all that it's hard for us to separate. And there truly is a separation anxiety. It's real in a lot of farmers, and it's difficult to sell those cows or do what we need to do to try to make ends meet financially. So there is life after cows leave the barn, or even after people leave the farm. It is a tough reality, and Lord knows it's filled with stress and maybe even a lot of grief, but sometimes it's a necessary outcome in times when we're experiencing a lot of trouble. So hopefully all the market reality, all the stress and all the grief can be worked through. We do have to make tough choices at times, but that's with anything in life. We have to reach out to others, and extremely important during these times to reach out to others. And how do we explore all those options? Because sometimes we're the worst consultant on our own farm, not knowing what other options might actually be, because sometimes it's important to get an outside set of eyes on those farms. So giving life a new reality, whatever that might be, we realize that change is not easy, okay, but it's a given. And at times change has actually become a blessed opportunity for a lot of the farmers that I've worked with over the years, no matter how tough it got on the farm. Sometimes I've actually heard back several years later that after they had to sell the cows, it's one of the best decisions that ever happened to us, or one of the best decisions we ever made. So it's not like that for everybody, but hopefully this new acceptance is attained that again gives us that big word of hope of a meaningful life. And it might be different than before, but it's a meaningful life. So let's take this scenario that we're in this boat, this situation together. We have this bridge, we have this river to cross. I'm going to challenge you that there's 3 types of people in this world. A group of people that are going to look at everything they do in life as a problem, and they're going to share that problem with others. Others are going to take a look at that exact same issue that comes to them, and they're going to look at this thing as a challenge. And still others are even going to take it a little bit further and say, this isn't just a challenge, this is an opportunity for me to do something different, maybe get on with my life in a different phase. Okay, so again, is it a problem? Is it a challenge? Is it an opportunity as we're dealing with our lives? So the problem in life is not that there are problems, in my mind. The problem is expecting life without problems and thinking that having a problem is always a problem. So that, my friends, so often becomes a problem. So know that overcoming problems often transforms us and builds us into becoming more than we were before. And problems often ignite more wholeness within us, which is why, again, I tend to say having a problem isn't always a problem, but sometimes it is. So when we have faith, we have to face our fear of problems. So we might have fear of heights or fear of the water, depending on how we're going to cross this bridge. We could have walked across the top of it, or we could have taken a boat across the river. Okay, but again, we got to face our fears, whatever those are. If we have too much in one, let's take another route. Again, problem, challenge, or opportunity. How do you live your life? So when will a derecho hit you, your farm, and your family? And you talk about trauma, 2020 in the state of Iowa. So we had this derecho come through, and there's a lot of pictures of what happened in some of this damage, and some you can't even think in your mind or just can imagine how those families dealt with that. But they did. Number one, when we take a look at when derechos, and whether it's a derecho, whatever hits us in this life, it happened. There is no turning back. But the important piece that we can't turn back is don't turn your back on the situation. We need to deal with it. How do we assess the damage? And I was amazed at some of the families that I worked with. I sat back and thought, well, this could have been a lot worse. And I'm sitting there thinking of all the devastation that just happened to your farm. Things got blown away. And you think it could have been worse. What a positive way to think of that. So how do we look up and how do we look forward? Despite this and despite that, there is a light at the end of that tunnel. And it may be a long tunnel, and that light might be pretty dim at the end of it. But once we get there, again, new meaning, new life. So how do we identify, deal with those feelings of being overwhelmed, the desperation, and just looking at the families that helped each other out to try to get through, to pick up from the storm was amazing. And then we take a look at throwing other stressors. You talk about piled up stressors, and you look at the dairy industry in the last 3 to 5 years, and then you throw COVID on top of that and all the protective issues and things like that. So when we take a look at that derecho, I'm basically talking about when trauma, fatigue, exhaustion, and hopelessness hits you and your family, what you gonna do when that stress comes for you? And hopefully we have it in our mindsets of how we're gonna deal with it. So we realize that farming is dangerous physically and mentally. It's stressful. Farmers have varying degrees of resiliency to stress to try to deal with both the physical and the mental dangers of it. And farming has this integrated blend of families. Sometimes there's 3 generations out there working on the farm, maybe even 4. And we have to look at different, brothers working together with their spouses and their children. So multi-families working together as well. So how do we take a look at these unique situations of stress that all blend into this farm? So one of the biggest things I think we need to look at is that stress is so very normal, okay? Our lives would be difficult without stress, okay? And stress can actually be very healthy for us as well, because stress is undoubtedly, it's our arousal and it's our engagement to life, okay? So how can we think of this as positive, but we need to realize when it gets to be too much, beyond our comfort zone, beyond our performance level, again, that exhaustion, that trauma, when things start breaking, okay, that's when we need to be concerned, because too much acute stress that just happens like the derecho, or piled up chronic stress of all those stresses that are piled up in that one slide, it makes it difficult to do these things, to concentrate, to remember, and to process, and think about how important these are to farm management decisions and our family decisions, to organize, to calculate, to decide, to sleep, to eat, relax, and breathe, and how important those things are to just managing stress. But it's difficult when we have too much. and to communicate, to share, to bond is so very important in dealing with stress. So chronic stress can weaken our spirit, our appetite, and that's just not nutritional, but our appetite for doing things, our relationships, the physical, mental stamina, our strength, our ability to focus and again, make those decisions, dampen happiness, our satisfaction. But we realize that there are some life skills that we can help people with that can try to deal with it as best we can. We also realize that stress can be a source of conflict, but it can also help families grow together, as many farm families are strong because they had to go through a derecho or some tough time together. When we think about time overload, okay, not just the farmer, but think about the farm spouses and to think about those families. There just isn't enough time in the day for us to think, to process, to be in the quiet, to be bored, which delays our creativity, our time to love, to play, and actually enjoy our work because we're moving from one activity to another, especially on the farm. We got to get this task done and that task. We don't have the mindfulness to sit there and at least try to process and think about how much I'm enjoying this task because we got to get on to the next one. We're living our lives, living into the future. Not good for anxiety and stress. We're also overwhelmed because of that as well. So this rope is starting to tear, not just in our brains, but in our minds and sometimes within our families and on our farms. And that protective mindset, when we have to start being so time overloaded, we start getting that protective mindset. We lack our self-care. We're trying to protect ourselves so much that we can't forward think through a lot of it. So, but this is the new norm in farm life. And this is why farm stress has become such a big topic over the last few years. So again, those smaller amounts of margin in both time and finances, in addition to other internal, external forces in so many farm families, is a new situation for us. So too much stress can lead to distress, okay? The anxiety, the doubt, depression, hopelessness that I talked about. So let's talk about the brain and stress. So the brain is about 3 pounds of our total body weight. But yet it uses about 25% of our energy, according to John Schutzke at UW-Madison. He showed me some of the research. So when we take a look at your brain on stress, what percentage of the energy is actually used when you're under a lot of stress? And I can venture to mention that it's probably a lot more than 25%. In groups, I like to ask the question. Nobody ever gives me an answer, and I have to say, well, I don't know either, but I was hoping somebody would know. But we talk about this brain and stress. The chronic stress can shorten our brain receptors. It can actually kind of impair the way that things actually flow through the brain, our nerve endings as well. Overcoming stress can, by developing these skills and trying to work with a lot of this brain health that people are talking about, can help us have more resiliency to the farm stress itself. So what I'd like to do is kind of step back a little bit. And we'll take a look at it. We developed an acronym called a Primer on Farm Stress Resiliency that I'd just like to run through quickly. So the P stands for perception. Those are our thoughts under stress, that image, that picture we have in our mind. The R stands for reality. That's both our internal capacity and the environment that we're working with in our stress. The I stands for identify. How important is it for us to identify our emotions? Some people talk about, well, how are you feeling today? And everybody say, well, good, bad, but they don't identify, well, I'm feeling a little anxious today, or a little tense about this, or I'm very happy about this. Okay, how do we learn to identify those emotions? And how do we manage? And this one will take a little more time, but just our thoughts and our reaction, which is the most important part to the stress itself. And how do we extend ourselves, our communication, both to ourselves and to other people? And what resources do we have at our disposal, our support for stress itself? So let's start with perception. It's very heavily related to that picture that we have in our minds. And it's coupled with any meaning, so emotions and attitudes that we tend to attach to these perceptions. So sometimes of who we think we are might not be who other people see us as, okay? So an occurrence can also happen to two people, and one might view it very positively, another person very negatively, and it's the exact same thing that happened to both of them, okay? Perception, it's important. So until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life, and you will call it fate. That's a quote from the famous psychologist Carl Jung. Okay, so let's take a look at this iceberg. With stress, it is so very important to know what we can control and what we can't. Okay, so the bottom line is we need to accept what we can control, even if it's unfair. And I say that very strongly because an unforgiving spirit can so greatly add to our stress and what we carry, the burden on our shoulder by having this unforgiving spirit. So maintaining a sense of control, and even if it's small, can make a huge difference. So let's take a case in point of these 3 mice. Okay, so there was a research study done back, I think the 50s or 60s, it's been a while ago. Okay, so they had 3 groups of mice. The control group just lived their normal mice life in this maze. They would hear a bell, they could push a button, no matter what they did not get the shock. The second group of mice, every time that they heard the bell, they realized that about 80% of the time, if they touched that button, they would still get the shock, but the important part was 20% of the time they did not. The third group of mice, when they touched the button, heard the bell, touched the button, is that they would get the shock 100% of the time. So the third group did not fare so well, didn't live so long. The first group just lived a normal mouse life, but the interesting group was the second group. Those that only had a 20% chance of not getting the shock, they still had some control, okay, did not fare that much different than the control group. So again, maintaining that sense of control, even if it's small, can make a huge difference in controlling our stress. So this slide here is basically dealing that resilient people don't have less stress. Okay, they tend to just deal with it better. And I can't say that in all cases, but it's a tendency. Okay, so how are you feeling physically, mentally, and emotionally? If you read across this, are you a 1 in each of those categories, a 2, a 3, or a 4? Okay, so if you add up your total score and you're a 1 in all 3 of those categories, you've got a score of 3. You're doing quite well. Okay, so I would tend to say people typically have 2 of those, or maybe one of those, or might be in the second category or whatever. Okay, so when we start taking a look at people that are scoring in this 3, I would tend to say that they start needing help. You start adding up your scores in that 7 to 9, or if they're greater than 9, it's not just that they need help, but you better be helping them get some help, okay, because they probably can't process enough to actually do it themselves. Okay, we also realize that resilient people are more proactive, they're less reactive or passive. Okay, so in what they can control or how they're influenced by others in the environment, or they just wait for things to solve themselves. So I say plan rather than hope. Don't be a victim mentality person and live your life that way. And don't just hope rather than plan. And you can kind of read down through those about how proactive some of those comments are about I plan to, I decided to, I want to, versus I can't help it. Or things will work out over time, or this isn't my decision, or it's just the way it is. Resilient people undoubtedly do something about the situations in life. So the R stands for reality. We all live with a different reality in life, and even families within the same household live with a different reality. But it's a sum of our internal capacity and our external environment just to understand the situation that surrounds the stress event or a crisis event and how we're going to seek remedy for that. So one of the realities I like to share, we've always heard this concept that the grass is greener, but quite often what we think will make us happy often doesn't give us true joy. So we have these thoughts about keeping up with the Joneses, the new tractor, a better milk price, getting a new home, better genetics in our cows, a cooler car. Okay, kids are notorious for that. Okay, so once we get it, we often find out that it was the thought of getting it that gave that perception of happiness. But in reality, we find out that wasn't so. And if we don't get it, we so often play that blame game, that victim mentality, that life isn't fair. We have this unforgiving spirit that I should have gotten it. And we spend our lives thinking, if only I would have, or if only I would have done this, my life would have been so much better. If only somebody else would have done this. Okay, I like this study of the lottery winners. So 1 year after these people had won the lottery, they found out that their happiness was the same as the people in the control group that did not win the lottery. And even more so, they found out that paralyzed people rated their pleasure in everyday activities as high as the lottery winners. Okay, what is our perspective, our perception of life as we know it, and what is our reality? So we move on to identify. So we identify these emotions because we realize that emotions, just think of a big ball of barbed wire maybe in your brain. They're so intertwined and they're connected to each other, and they're often mangled, okay? And it's difficult sometimes for us to identify the underlying causes of these emotions, okay? So when we take a look at the counseling phase, we don't spend that much time, sorting out the facts. It's people's emotions that take, and I think sometimes they gauge it at 70, 80, 90% of our time trying to help people sort through their emotions, okay? Just because it's tough for us some to identify this emotion that was contacted or connected to something that happened 3 years ago that grandma said way back when, or something like that. So they're definitely very interconnected. Anger. So we take a look at anger. Is it a good emotion? Anger protects ourselves. So I tend to say all emotions are good to a point. Okay, it's the underbalance or the overbalance of them that actually causes a problem. So it's often expressed due to something else. We don't just usually feel angry just because we want to feel angry. We feel angry because somebody did something or something else happened. So it might be easiest when we get angry to transfer that cause to the person that's closest to us. A lot of times it might be a spouse, and say we're part of the environment when this thing happened to us, okay, even though they weren't the source of it, but we take our anger out on somebody else. So again, the important part with all these emotions, especially the negative ones, is to identify them and do not transfer. But by all means, try to transfer those positive emotions to other people because we realize they're contagious as well. So anxiety and depression often have a root cause. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's more emotional, mental. So look inward to identify causes, and again, try not to transfer those negative emotions onto other people. So in positive psychology, our goal is positive emotions regarding stressful and other situations, no doubt. You remember the pie chart about what we can control and what's a circumstance. So we realize that situations, circumstances exhibit chemical reactions in our body, and these trigger our emotions. And then our brain labels this emotion as bad, good, happy, sad, whatever. So it's kind of a mind over matter deal. Positive thoughts, precursors to positive feelings and emotions. A very important piece for us to understand. So the skill to learn is how to identify these emotions of circumstances while thinking those positive thoughts in our control. Okay, and again, that was about 40% of the total was actually in our control with that. So we are about as happy as we make up our minds to be. Okay, I think that's more than just a saying. So choose happy and try to return there even when life gets us down. And granted, it's easier said than done, especially when we're under a lot of this farm stress that a lot of us have experienced to high levels. So the M stands for manage. We're going to spend a little bit more time with this one because we need to manage our thoughts under this stress. Okay, realize that all situations have hope, alternatives, and options. Okay, there is no situation that's just hopeless. Identify what can be controlled. We saw the importance of that, and accept what is beyond control without blaming ourselves. As guilt, we realize research will actually show that guilt actually has its own negative consequences. We need to be more compassionate sometimes for ourselves and forgiving of ourselves for some of the things that happen within our lives, even if we make the mistake. So understand that lack of clarity of the future can induce stress as it brings about worry, confusion, conflict, and even shame, according to Donna Boss and some of her research. So I'm going to ask us to use this, what I call a be set tool, to help us take the sting out of stress. And I also say the best place to be is together. So let's set our stress straight with it. So the first one is to breathe. When I work with people sometimes come back and I'll ask them, what was the most helpful thing? He goes, of all the things that you went through, the simple fact that you taught me how to breathe was the most important. Now, I want you to think, for those that know what animals are like on a hot day, and cows start panting, they go through a lot of heat stress, okay? And they go through a lot of shallow, quick pants. That is not what I want us to do, but that is what happens sometimes when we get under stress and we get these anxiety attacks, a lot of short pants. I want us to learn how to breathe deep, not shallow, to do nasal and stomach breathing, okay? So our slow in breaths kind of amp up our attitude. So if we want to get excited about something, take a lot of short breaths up, okay? And their drawn out breaths tend to help us relax, okay? So slow and drawn out if we want to try to relax. So on one hand, we get more oxygen to the brain, on the other hand, more relaxation. But either way, we get better decision making because we're either working with our alertness or our calmness, and both are pretty important in the breathing exercises. So the exercise to heart pumping levels, again, there's just so many things that happen with exercise to increase blood and oxygen flow to the brain. And I say this as if health allows. So the release of endorphins and other neurotransmitters as we take a look at exercise. Doesn't have to be running. There's a lot of different types of ways we can exercise, but it can definitely impact our serotonin levels, which we'll deal with a little bit later, which is our kind of our happiness hormone. But regular exercise also helps balance your body's level of stress, various hormones such as adrenaline as well. So then eating. So how do we eat to feel better? One of the things, and again, I'm not a nutritionist either, but we take a look at what a lot of the research is showing about added sugars and processed carbs and what that does to our mindset, our anxiety levels, and things like that. So I tend to try to use mindset tactics with eating. So it's kind of a moment on my lips or forever on my hips, or it's either going to go to waste, this food, because I was always taught to clean my plate off. It's either going to go to waste or it's going to go to my waste. Or how do we just purge the urge? Because we know these emotions, these sometimes these indulgences, these impulses are pretty fleeting, sometimes 15 seconds, sometimes 30, sometimes 90 seconds. But let's just purge the urge, take these deep breaths and just let that emotion pass. So the S stands for, I couldn't make a decision here because all three of these are so important, of how we smile, how we see things, and how we sublime. And subliming is kind of trading our pain for something else, something that's more pleasant visually. And I tend to say, take a look at panoramic, soft vision, the big view of tens of things, thinking of happy times. So whether you be at an ocean or out in your pasture, looking at the horizon. And other places that tend to relax the mindset and just allow us to change our thoughts for a while, because if we're so focused on that problem, it's difficult for us to really take a look and be more better at decision making and just have a general better attitude about what life experiences are. So the E stands for express. And how do we express to ourselves acceptance of the reality of whatever happened to the situation? And how do we then focus, on a response or a solution, instead of the back brain, part of our brain, our protective brain, that's always focusing on the problem, trying to protect ourselves. We need to move on from that and focus on responses and solutions. And then the T stands for talk. How do we talk through ourselves with positive emotions that yes, I can do this, or I need to do that, or I don't need to do that. It's kind of an attitude. It's a positive attitude, and stand tall when we do that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the fourth session as well, about what posture actually does for our inner being as well. So extending also, we realize that social isolation, and so now we're actually moving back to the primer acronym. So the social isolation and loneliness can actually increase our stress. We're best helped by family, people they trust, and that's why I'm such a big believer in mental health first aid. So how do we train more people to kind of understand what's happening with mental health? And it's not the mental illness, it's mental health on the positive side of things. We realize that introverted males often do not extend thoughts and feelings very readily to allow for healthy family support. And so sometimes I just say, a lot of times it's personality type traits that we really need to understand to help people, because sometimes, our personalities inhibit us. So guilt, shame, tradition, social stigma often inhibit extending others for help as well. So feeling close to others, we realize that increases oxytocin in the blood. So doing things for others, it increases happiness. It reduces that focus on self and our personal problems. And it's actually kind of a subliming topic as well. So this word gratitude, research-wise, it's amazing of how do we count our blessings, because in helping others, even when struggling, it can increase our positive feelings of ourselves and others as well. It gains perspective. It gains optimism, life satisfaction, connectedness to others. Pretty important piece of the extending puzzle. So the more we overcome our personal ego boundaries, the more we become intertwined with other people's lives. And that's one of our goals in life. So it comes from Scott Peck and The Road Less Traveled, one of the favorite books I ever read. So when extending ourselves to others, we often tend to find new perspectives. We tend to find new mindsets, not to mention better feelings of the stressful situations that are at hand. And we experience that basic need of human compassion, which is our compassionate levels is a basic personality trait as well. So then we move to the R, which is for resources. Resources are so important in life, whether it be financial, personal, other types of resources, spiritual. So families that are able to make more positive meaning of their stressors and use effective coping strategies, as well as internal, coming from inside ourselves, and external resources are more likely to adapt as well. So this applies to us as individuals too. Internal resources and coping strategies, and we'll deal with that in some other sections of this webinar series as well. So we want to focus on these four things for external resources: interpersonal communication, family and community support, problem-solving techniques, and our goal setting. So everybody has their own beliefs, their feelings, their needs, their agenda that needs to be shared. So we need to know healthy ideal versus unhealthy and common behaviors, communication skills that separate success and failure, in overcoming stresses and actually interpersonal conflict as well. We also realize when we talk about family and community support that there's just immediate family, there's intergenerational families, and they're all intertwined with our communities and things like that. So they can be a source of great stress. They can also be a source of great strength as well. And that's what we want to focus on. So we use these processes to the problem-solving techniques to define problems, to consider pros and cons, different types of alternatives, identifying resources and using family and group meetings. I use these in our farm couple getaways all the time. Okay, so teaching families to be more proactive in problem solving. And so I tend to use this line here from George Strait to write this down. Okay, and I've had families in the farm couple getaways. You know, like one family I remember, they said, you know, we've been dealing with this problem since the 1970s. And it wasn't until the fact that you made us write this down that we ever got anywhere in trying to solve it. It is so very, very important for our goals in life and even writing out our future goals called futuring, to write these things down so we can better attain those, because research will show we will better attain them if we write them down. So we can use SMART goals or whatever kind of tool you want to try to work with, but definitely write them down. So now we're going to move on to serotonin. We talked a lot about happiness, and one of the biggest hormones that we take a look at is the neurotransmitter that is a contributor to feelings of well-being and happiness, helping modulate cognition, our thought process, reward, learning, memory, physiological processes as well. It's extremely important, which is why they call it the antidepressant. So it's the key to the happiness index. It defends against anxiety, depression. It helps the feel of self, life, and the world around you. Okay, problem solving, building relationships, achieving goals in life. Okay, so I think it's extremely important. When we don't have it, okay, we tend to have more stress, and we can actually have people that have low serotonin levels that tend to have serotonin-related stress disorders. So here's 6 habits that I'm going to just share real quickly about how to secrete more serotonin in our brains and in our bodies. And when we take a look at sleep, if I was to look at all of them, I would tend to say sleep is probably the most important. And when we take a look at the research on sleep, it's unbelievable. Those that lack sleep, and we think about ourselves as farmers, you know, sometimes running those 16, 18-hour days and still trying to do family type things, and we lack the sleep. So very important for us to get that extra hour of sleep, because it makes us less emotional and more rational. Okay, so you think about higher irritability and what that does to relationships versus being more rational when we need to make those tough decisions on the farm. Okay, sleep becomes extremely important. And sometimes with sleep, I'll focus on the women, because there's a huge difference in enjoyment of their lives during the day. It's more than income, it's more than marital status, their religion, or time pressures. Okay, what that happens, and sometimes, and we'll actually deal with this in another session, about what happens with time pressures in women in stress on the farm, because sometimes, you know, they're doing full-time jobs, caring for the kids, doing things in the house as well. And so when we talk about farm stress, we realize that this is not just a male thing. Sometimes more importantly, and even more so, it might be a female thing. When we take a look at smile and laughter, again, it's worth making a habit. Smiling is significant. It might be a small significance, but every smile is significant, I think, in our lives. So exercising and our posture. So 7 minutes a day of some heart-throbbing exercise, again, just to get that blood flowing. We're going to feel better. And very seldom after exercising do you not feel better. You might not feel best the next morning if you get a little stiff and things like that, but you'll feel better afterwards. So exercise enhances well-being and helps prevent significantly reduce anxiety, depression. And I think the key point is here, as effective as medication for severe depression. So again, the importance of exercise. We take a look at social bonding and loneliness that can actually reduce our years. Spirituality, how do we pray and meditate about it? Because research will show that's pretty important to us as well. Again, that calming effect. In our diet. And we talk about serotonin. And a lot of the literature will show that the gut itself, the stomach, will actually secrete 90 to 95% of the serotonin in our bodies. And so I think it's important for us to do that. So when we take a look at habits for serotonin, my question to you is, what does your serotonin picture look like? Because I think it's important for us to at least try to visualize, get a perception in our mind of how important this is in our lives. So I'm going to just go out on a limb here and kind of share what some of mine is. When we take a look at faith and family and kind of the closest to other people, I tend to very much like pasture settings. Okay, so I love the concept of grazing, getting out in pastures. My wife would say that I could live out in a pasture, and sometimes I actually do because I've got a few campers and things like that out there. Okay, so my background is actually as a pastoral psychologist. And so one time I'm in a meeting and somebody asked me how I got a doctorate degree in grazing psychology. Okay, but it's more of a ministry degree, but I use that kind of as a tongue-in-cheek a bit about how important this pastoral, this panoramic view of pastures and the grass and walking among nature with the water and the cattle and things like that. So how important that might be to somebody's serotonin levels, because I know it's important to mine. Okay, so other types of things are just how do we engage in difficulty and overcome difficulty, and how do we engage in our love, our work, and play, because that engagement can help increase the serotonin levels as well. So I'm going to just list a bunch of them that I think are some ones that I want you to think about. Faith, family, farm, friends, the amount of sleep, animals, pets, and our connection to them can increase it. Water sports, nature, sunlight, trees, music, personally I like the guitar, singing, dancing, exercising, fire, whether it be campfires or lighting a fire and just really looking at that fire, the wind, how we breathe, smile, our laughter, how we socialize with other people, but how we meditate maybe on our own, our mindfulness and different types of things, our generosity to other people. And again, this panoramic vision of what we have in life, that we're part of something larger, tends to be a little bit important as well. So what causes serotonin deficiencies? So there's a lot of things on the list, but the one I'm going to kind of go on is the farm chemicals. So when we take a look at, and I used to teach farm chemical safety, as easy as sweat comes out of our body when we're sweating, farm chemicals can actually get into those pores as well and actually infiltrate our body. So we might have inhalation exposure, we might have skin exposure, respiratory exposure, different types that we have, but just kind of be cautious on farm chemicals and their relationship to different things that are happening with our stress. Okay, so if we have shortage of serotonin, again, low energy, negative thoughts, just take a look at the opposite of what's going on here to try to increase our serotonin. And if it's not there, other things that are negative can happen to us as well. So now we're going to move into kind of stage 4 of the presentation, which is actually on grief, because a lot of us experience grief, and you're not probably going to go through your life without experiencing grief. So we just lost what? So we realize that farming is a high-risk occupation, both in physical safety and also financial security. And that natural environment with weather, you've got the market forces, their hard work, it can end up in a profit, but we can also end up in a loss. And so we're doing our Schedule F. It might be a grieving process versus a happy process. Okay, so loss is a reality of the life. It's a reality to farming. You know, things die on the farm, our crop is flooded, things just don't work out. So we realize that grief is a part of everybody's life. It's a life event where someone that is loved suddenly or slowly ceases to be part of our lives. And so we love them so much, which is why the grief part is pretty hard. So grief, we also realize, is a normal part of life, and it can actually be healthy as we react to that loss of something that is loved and cherished. Okay, so dealing with grief, I tend to say, is a very much a learned skill to help us understand grief, okay, not to overcome it, but to process through it and hopefully return to normal functioning at some point in time. So we have acute losses, a barn fire, an unexpected illness, a death, a car accident. We have chronic loss, might be loss of profits, a way of life, and something that's happening over the course of time, or the course of months, the course of years. We have ambiguous loss. So sometimes we lose things and we're not sure what it was, how, the whys of what happened. So sometimes when we have people losing the farm, it's kind of an ambiguous loss to them. They don't understand exactly what's happening to them because they don't understand all the market forces and none of us understand. So we need to process of grief to actually deal with that loss. Okay, so I want you to think that even though the loss is typically bad, the good grief process can actually be good in just helping us deal with the loss and trying to get our lives to return to a meaningful life at some point in time. So I'm going to give a little bit of a good grief recipe. So grief is so very unique. When we work in bereavement, everybody needs their own recipe. And we think about the session we're going to do on personalities, farm personalities. Everybody's got their own personality as well to deal with the grief. Okay, so sometimes it's such important for us to understand that. But everybody's unique and they're going to deal with it in their own way. Grief takes time, and it's different for everybody. Let it work in due time. So often we hear when people are grieving over the loss of somebody, especially, is that, well, aren't they over that yet? It's been 2 years. Okay, so again, it's not that we ever want to get over it, but we do want to healthfully process through that grief. So we realize that grief has loss, but how do you keep memories alive? And I sometimes remember, the first time I went through a day and I said, well, I didn't think about mom all day or my brother all day. Okay, and I felt kind of guilty about that. But how do you try to keep those memories alive? Because it is something we loved and cherished. So grief can cause anger. We need to be aware and response. Okay, so at any given time, we might be talking to somebody that's going through the grieving process. A word might get said or whatever. It might set off some anger, some anxiety, some withdrawal. Okay, so we just need to be aware of that in our response. Grief is messy. There is no doubt about it. To let the mind and the body cry, that grief has to get out of our body somehow. And crying is actually a very healthy way. Exercise is a very healthy way. Deep breathing is a healthy way. There's a lot of healthy ways that we can actually get that grief. Social bonding, extremely important to try to get that grief out of our bodies. Grief is extreme stress, and so we need to practice safety because our thought processes might not be, right up to par as we're going through this grief because it is extreme stress. Grief tastes bitter. Okay, and that's sometimes what we get caught in is the bitterness of the grief, and how do we try to recall the happy times and try to use our prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, to process through this grief in a more positive way. Grief can feel lonely, and other people feel lonely during this time as well. Sometimes it's important to realize, after somebody dies, say in a community, I get this a lot, is that somebody passes away, right away the whole community's there. Okay, within 2-3 weeks, especially that day. But who's going to be that person to be there 6 months down the road, a year down the road, and want to try to talk with somebody about it? So I have a case that I like to share that I was working with somebody, and then we were kind of talking about, so I asked him how his daughter was doing and actually mentioned her by name. And he was a little taken back by that. And so I have this process that I'll do it because usually they don't want to say much in the first time, so I'll bring her name back up a second time. And he put his drink down and he said, well, I appreciate you saying something about it because I want to talk about it and nobody ever wants to talk about it. Okay, they won't even mention her by name. It's like she never existed in the first place. Okay, so very lonely feeling, thinking that nobody else either cares or understands anymore. So I do like to encourage people to take that 2-stage process to check with somebody to see if they want to talk about it. If they don't respond by the second time, we'll talk about something else, but at least I made the effort to help them try to talk about it. Grief stops one's world and the world moves on. And this is one of the hardest things, I think, for a lot of grieving people to deal with, is that, something serious, we lost a family member, whatever, after a couple of weeks, people start to quickly forget and the world moves on. And it's still a year later and I'm still stuck in my grief, but yet the world doesn't even mention that person hardly anymore. So grief needs empathy, but accept the sympathy. We don't want to spend too much time with sympathy because sympathy tends to help people feel sorry for themselves. Empathy, more of that thought process to help them think above the feelings, to better deal with what's going on and to move on to life to more important meaning. So grief needs comfort, make the healthy choices because again, outside in, sometimes into our bodies, whether it be alcohol, whatever. Okay, so it gives us comfort, okay, but it might not be a healthy thing to do. So grief needs exercise. I like the analogy that sometimes, it's like your feet are standing in 2 5-gallon buckets of cement, and it's just tough to put one foot in front of the other foot. How do we move our spirit? So a grieving person, one of the best things I think you can do besides social contact is to actually take them out for a walk, get them out in nature, and a few things like that, just to lighten their spirits, because a lot of times they just hunker down they wallow in their own grief. So grief needs hope. So we tend to the feelings of despair. And again, that hope is something every time we leave the conversation, let's give somebody some hope to think about. Grief needs a smile at least once in a while. Again, trying to keep that positive attitude, give them something hopeful to smile about. So we also have some challenges when we talk about grief. Okay, and it's not just on the farm, it's what we experience within our families as well. People have different mindsets. Is there a plan? Is this somebody's fate? Is it a circumstance that happened because of free will? Is there a better plan in life? Okay, again, versus some kind of a circumstance. Why do bad things happen to good people? Or why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? Okay, or they're in a better place. Okay, so sometimes for a grieving parent that might have just lost a child, To say that they're in a better place might be a very difficult thing for them to accept. How can it be any better than having their lovely home with us and us as parents and their siblings and things like that? Okay, so some people might not be where you might be on a spiritual realm or something else, or have the same beliefs you have. And some of my pet peeves that after some of my sessions, people come up to me, at the funeral, somebody came up to said to me after my child had passed away, well, at least this, or at least that. And the thought process is, you just lost a child. What could be worse? Okay, so just kind of be cautious in what we say of at least this didn't happen or that didn't happen or something like that. But it's just some challenges that we have as we work with people in the grieving process, and trying to actually go through this quite a bit, just to encourage a lot more people to kind of think of themselves as bereavement ministers, to work with people. And I know there's a lot of church people that are attending this session, and to think of yourselves as a bereavement minister. Who is going to be that person 6 months down the road or a year down the road, to maybe knock at the door, send them a letter, an email, give them a phone call, actually physically talk to them versus a text, and just ask them how they're doing, or mention the name of the person that died a couple different times to see if they want to talk about it. So with grief, people often wonder, are you over it yet? But with good grief, the goal is not to get over it, but to savor the memories of what was lost, and to really try to process through that grief, again, to return us to more meaningful life in one's own time. So too often we underestimate the power of a touch, a smile, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment, or just sometimes the simplest act of caring, random act of kindness, all of which have the potential to turn a life around, from Leo Viscalia, one of my second favorite authors. So how do we let good grief build stamina to survive what we didn't think was possible? And we do that for good grief's sake. So here's a graph that I use in a lot of bereavement type things, whether it be on the farm or personally or whatever. But we've got this normal functioning, and something happened within our lives. So the avoidance, the confusion, the fear, the guilt, the blame, the frustration, the anger, all those things that actually kind of take us down into some kind of a rut. And it can be a rut that might last a long time. It could be a rut that goes pretty darn deep, but it's different for everybody. Okay, and then over time, we start to take a look at about reaching out to others, dialoguing, accepting kind of what happened. We return to a meaningful life. Might not be as good as before, might actually be better depending on what was lost. Okay, but we return to a meaningful life. And at any given point in time, a couple years down the road, we might find ourselves having a day or two where we might be right back down into that depression and that detachment and the blahs and everything that happened. Okay, so it's definitely a cycle to go through, and we can actually kind of revert back on it sometimes as well. But that's our goal in good grief, is to try to help people get returned to a meaningful life. So I've talked about a lot of different things. The farm market reality, we've talked a lot about the different types of happiness and stress, positive psychology. We shared some of the primer acronym, the BSET type acronym, to try to help deal with managing stress as well. Talked about serotonin levels, and then we talked about grief. Okay, so there's a farm resource stress package that we're going to share in the chat box that you can take along, distribute to other people as well. But that's part of the process, is for trying to provide resources to people as well. And I encourage you not just to take a look at it, but I also encourage you to read it yourself and to share it. So this farm resource package is also on our website, which is actually listed here. And there's a lot of other resources that are not just our Iowa State Extension resources, but from around the country as well, because there definitely are a lot of good resources that are happening with a lot of different organizations around the country in regards to farm stress. So I'm going to end this session with a meditative prayer. We realize what it does to our serotonin levels and just help try to relax us. And whoever you pray for, a higher being, or you pray to yourself or to somebody else, I'm going to ask us to help ourselves, to use higher reasoning thoughts, to better manage and to better face and manage our emotions, breathing deeply and smiling widely, be caring in my words and my actions, cautious in what I eat and drink, exercising to my heart's content, portraying positive posture, keeping my ears to the ground for others, that generosity, with my eyes fixed on the bigger horizon of life, looking forward and looking upward for myself and for my greater why in life. Amen.
Thank you, Larry. Uh, we are encouraging folks to put their questions into the chat box. Just type them in. We've got a couple to start with, and I'm going to start with how can we start a conversation with someone who seems depressed, but they deny it?
I think one of the things when we start taking a look at just working with people in stress is that there definitely is a lot of denial out there. And so when we try to do it, one of the things there's a couple things we mentioned about mental health first aid, but there's also another, what we call QPR, question, persuade, and refer. And so I think one of the biggest things we learn to do is to actively question. So the questions I would probably start off with is just kind of maybe making a few statements about, well, you seem like you're a little bit more anxious than you have been in the past, or I can tell like when I'm trying to work with something that your mind's not quite with me, or difficulty making decisions and things like that. And so kind of get a feel for them, I guess, first of all, just in a general sense about where we think they might be at. And then once we start getting some good reason to think that they are in a pretty stressed level, then we'll start asking the questions. And I think one of the biggest questions, and I'm just going to say it pretty directly, I might not be my first question or even my third question, but just the thought process. If we really think that they're, say, in a very stressed level, you saw that chart that I showed, if they're scored in at 7, 8, 9, 10, okay, I would get to the point where I would actually say, well, are you thinking about harming yourself? And research would actually show about, do not be afraid to actually use that word suicide. Are you thinking about committing suicide? We realize that most people that actually do commit suicide actually will leave some hints, or they will actually say something about it, or they will actually have a plan and things like that in place. And so I think the bottom line is for us to kind of try to gauge their level, and then ask the questions again about their comfort level, or starting to, like I said, a couple of the thought process about, you seem to be more anxious, or things don't seem to be working out this way or that way or whatever, but then do not be afraid to pose those questions. And then once we start getting a better feel, even after we pose the questions, and then how do you try to persuade people to really realize, and that's why I like that word hope. It's just, if you just keep that that word in the back of your mind about how to give them hope about this, or how to give them hope about that. And then if it really gets into a dire situation, the R stands for refer. Please don't just leave them alone. Just try to refer them to whatever resources you can think of at the time, because people, we realize, are sometimes best helped by some of their family members, some of the people that they consider friends, their pastors. Okay, sometimes even better than trained counselors. And so just somebody to talk to, and if they're in dire stress, that we don't leave them alone.
We've got another comment that says, working with family can be tricky, especially when they come around seasonally and bring the negativity with them. Do we see that? We've always heard the darker days of winter, but is that a thing?
Yeah, there's definitely things through the winter we tend to have, experience more anxiety and depression as we get into February and March, and hopefully with the sunshine and the warmer weather, we'll start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with that. But there definitely are a lot of instances and a lot of families that we can be having a very nice time, just getting together, laughing, doing whatever, and then somebody walks in the room that's got such a negative attitude, and it's amazing how one person can take 10 people's attitudes down very quickly. And so we will just, when you talk, and this is actually part of the video, which I apologize for, that was my technical difficulty about not knowing something there. So when we take a look at just that, how do we transfer these emotions, that they can happen very positively, it can also happen very negatively. Okay, so the negative ones seem like they happen a lot quicker, but just the whole concept about keeping a positive attitude, a smile, a chuckle, trying to find something to smile about, I think is very important, because again, those emotions transfer whether they're positive or negative.
Okay. Lots of agribusiness people carry farm stress back home to them every day. What is the role in assisting a farmer with this kind of distress?
I think I would take a look at most of us that work in agriculture and working with farmers. I hope that we would think about, it's kind of part of our job. Okay, maybe not to a large extent, but for us to be aware and to look for signs and to try to do things that we can try to do. And so like, as I work with bankers, especially, one of the things, finances get so overwhelming and so difficult sometimes to make decisions. Or as a financial consultant, that we realize that somebody's through the process where they can't concentrate and they can't actually plan through trying to make some kind of a plan, which is why we come back to that George Strait, write this down. So a lot of times they can't even think through it enough. If we give them 3 things to work on, I can guarantee they're going to walk out that door if they're heavily stressed, and they might not even remember any of them because their mind is someplace else. And so again, what can we kind of write down 2 or 3 things that they can work on? And again, to give them some hope that let's meet back here in a couple of weeks. Let's give them some hope of something that they can work on. And if we do get to a point where we have some, farmers that are in some serious distress, it's kind of like the last question as well, is that it's not just that we need to help them, but we might need to find them some help.
We've got a follow up when we were talking about being pointed about suicide. Don't you think that asking that question, are you thinking about harming yourself, may give them the idea to do that?
Yeah, and I think is that question's actually been researched because it's a pretty important one if we are going to make that question, if it does cause them to do that. But research will show it actually does not. And so I know I've lived a lot of my counseling type years before I knew about that research. That I was always afraid to say that word as well. And so as I take a look at the last couple of years, and then after I've seen some of the research with that, is that people just said they want to understand, well, you are concerned about me. Okay, so you are using a pretty strong word there, but it does kind of show that you're willing to use it and you're willing to have this tough conversation with me, because when you talk about stress and anxiety, depression that comes often before that, I mean, those are tough conversations to have with people, and we need to have those tough conversations.
Okay, while we're waiting for any other questions to come in, we've got one here that was sent in early. You shared lots about positivity towards thinking about stress, but we've all had days when you just can't get your mind off that thing that was wrong or went wrong. What can someone do when they just can't sleep or function because of it?
Okay, so and I think the important thing is that it's actually very normal. Everybody goes through it. You can be a very low stress type person. You're still going to have your days once in a while where you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't think about anything else besides this little bit of it might be a small issue, it might be a big issue. Okay, so I would actually try to step back as best I can, because I know the biggest thing that works for me, and research will show it works for a lot of people as well, is to really start working on those breathing techniques. Okay, so in the 3rd session, we're actually going to maybe it's in the 4th session, but we're actually going to work through some higher end breathing techniques that we can try to work with to kind of relax our mind. So the other thing I would tend to say is that when we focus on a lot of stress, it's so hard for us to not just focus on that stress. So how do we kind of trade our mindset, get ourselves on a different plane of thought, get ourselves maybe physically in a different place, something that's more soothing to us. But sometimes we have to remove ourselves from that situation to actually go someplace different, just for us to be able to work with it. So I think when we take a look at the whole concept of how do you manage that, there definitely is, because when you're in a really bad mood and things are tough, it's extremely difficult sometimes to even smile. So if you have that frown on your face, that smile doesn't come. So it's easy for us to say, be positive and smile. Okay, but that's more of a cognitive type thing. We've got to get over that stress first, and it's going to be either an inside out type thing. So besides the breathing, and again, if we can't sleep, but sometimes even taking a sleeping pill, because that sleep is so darn important to our serotonin levels. And so if we can't sleep, sometimes we might need some help to do that as well.
Okay, we had a question come in. How can we take care of ourselves when some of the extended family that also comes to work has fallen into alcoholism and makes things unsafe at times?
Okay, now let's get into a situation. We start looking at people in alcoholism and other different types of addictions. It really gets to a point where they need professional help. Okay, so I'm not a licensed counselor, so I really can't even give advice of what to do there, but whatever we can do to try to get them some professional help into that, because I think when we take a look at those addictions, and a lot of times it's a concept that people might not even realize that they're alcoholics. Okay, sometimes when they're addicted to different types of things, we might be the last ones to realize that when people are depressed, sometimes they're one of the last ones to realize how depressed they truly are, but family and friends would kind of know that. Okay, so, but if it is a serious alcoholism issue, I would seriously make sure that they get some professional counseling with that, with a licensed professional.
Okay, a final question of the evening is, when you've had one of those days and you walk in through the kitchen door and find the person you value most in the world, and you stop barking right off the bat, give give us one thing we can do to not take it out of on our spouse.
Again, I think that's very crucial because, you know, sometimes when they were taking a look at some things about divorce, they were actually taking a look at simple things like how somebody parked the car in the driveway, how somebody might put the toilet paper roll on, some very simple things that actually blow up because it puts a negative thought in our mind just before we go see that person. Okay, so if we have that negative thought in our mind, we might respond our first comment to them very negatively. So what I try to do in my own life, and I know my spouse tries to work with this as well, is that just before we see each other, we're going to try to put a smile on our face, okay, and actually force ourselves to smile and think something positive before we actually, you know, we might talk about this, that, or the other thing, because sometimes the days are so darn stressful, and if you walk in the door and you have something that you haven't thought through, and you're still, you know, work is still bothering you, or something happened with that late milking, and now you come into the house and you bring all that negativity, by all means, you're going to transfer that not just to your spouse, but to the whole family. So just try to hijack the mind. And that's kind of what session number 4 is going to be about.
Thank you very much, Larry. We appreciate the folks who gave us questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Jen to close us out this evening.
All right. Well, thanks, Larry, for that great topic and intro to our rural resiliency webinar here. And just as a reminder, we will be back next Tuesday night at 7:30, and that topic will be personality keys when married to farm stress. So I think, Larry, you kind of alluded to some of those tips here in that last question, but we're going to go further into that personality styles when we're talking about being married to the farm. And so again, I just want to remind you that there are an evaluation survey in the chat box. If you're unable to click on that link tonight, we will do a follow-up email and get that out to you if you want to fill it out at a later time. But we really do would appreciate you filling that out. I also did put in the chat box the link to the farm stress packet that Larry had referred to in his presentation there. So that's the farm stress resource guide that you could download from our website. So again, I thank everybody for joining us here tonight. I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday night.